relationship between Marxists in the United States and the Soviet Union is an interesting and complex one because initially, with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, a good number, I would say a majority of socialists in the United States embraced the Bolshevik Revolution and believed that it could serve as a model for a new American revolution. But of course, there were others who disagreed, and there's a long-standing theoretical debate about the degree to which a revolution in a nation such as Russia, which was predominantly feudal prior to 1917, could be modeled in a nation like the United States, which already had, um, by 1917, probably the most advanced industrial capitalist system in the world. I guess it was like comparing apples and oranges. And so this was a long-standing debate that during the 1930s came to fruition in the Communist Party and the sort of anger at those in the Communist Party or the leadership of the Communist Party, which was oftentimes following orders from Moscow. And so you get lots of left-wing sectarianism in the United States over whether or not to align a left with the Soviet Union. There were lots of critics of what was considered Soviet political repression, especially Stalinism and the purges of the 1930s. There were lots of critics of the style, even though lots of Americans on the left and liberals, in fact, embraced the command economy of the Soviet Union during, for example, World War II, when the US had its own version of a command economy. There were lots of people on the left who did not think that a command economy was going to be the solution. And so essentially, the Soviet Union acted as a sounding board for American Marxists about what might and might not be possible in the United States. Early on, there were lots of American leftists who I think, wanted to embrace the revolution of 1949. But of course, 1949 was a tough year to embrace a communist revolution in the United States because the US was embroiled in a Red Scare of unprecedented proportion. And so even members of the State Department who might have been on the left, they might not have been Marxist, but if they're on the left and somewhat sympathetic to the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in the years after the Second World War, or at least they were attempting to explain to the American establishment that the Communist Party was inevitably going to come to power. Even they were purged from their positions and suffered political and economic consequences. So it was a tough position for people in the United States to take. During the 1960s, though, as lots of Americans formed international solidarity with people struggling against imperialism around the world in the context of the anti-war movement against the US war in Vietnam. There were people on the left who considered themselves Maoists in the sense that they believed that they should support what in the US we call third world revolution, or like peasant revolution. I guess communist revolution that wasn't necessarily centered around an industrial capitalist working class. And there was a lot of solidarity for a while in the 1960s, 1970s, particularly amongst Black and other non-white leftists in the United States. Um, I think that for the most part, the left in the US and perhaps the whole West has been less enamored with China since the 1960s. And maybe ambivalence is the right word to describe it, because there is this sense, even as China has improved the living conditions for millions of people in the last 30 years, raised the standard of living for so many people, there is a sense that China has combined, at least in the US, there's this sense amongst the left that China's combined a sort of authoritarian centralized communist party with market solutions. And this is like something that a lot of people in the American left can't get along with. But I would say ambivalence is probably the right way to describe it because um, as the right and the center in the US has at various times tried to start a new Cold War with China, people on the left are against that. So ambivalence is probably the right word. I think so in the sense that China, it seems to me from an American perspective, has raised the standards of living for so many people in ways that might have been unexpected by, like, say, Marxists in the early 20th century. They've embraced some market reforms and yet have, through state policy and state action, been able to equalize, have been able to distribute I guess, the profits of these market reforms to many people in ways that the US and the rest of the Western nations were able to also do to some degree during the middle of the 20th century, but we've failed to do so in the last 50 years. So I think there's a lot of room, a lot of space for dialogue between the U.S. and China, in particular between the U.S. left and um, Chinese intellectuals and politicians. I think there's a lot of space for that. I don't know how much of that type of dialogue is happening necessarily, but I think there's space for it. From my vantage point, it's a high-tech version of long-standing dynamics that Marx isolated. Marx, in Capital and in others of his writings, including the Grundrisse, wrote extensively about automation. That is, he wrote extensively about the ways in which the capitalist modes of production um, would be organized such as to discipline the labor force. The more disciplined the labor force, the better profits would be, at least in the short term, even though he also recognized that disciplining the labor force too much in the short term would generate crises in the long term. And I think we're witnessing that right now, as we have been for the last 30 or 40 years. But I think that AI, surveillance, all of these things are checks on democracy. They're checks on the power of the people. They're checks on the working class. And in particular, AI is a way to remove people from the labor force such that profits can persist without those pesky things like workers and workers' unions in particular. And surveillance is often used to crush working class and other radical movements, such as to remove those threats to capital. But this is a longstanding tradition amongst the capitalist class in the United States. For example, during the Gilded Age, the state and paramilitary organizations such as the Pinkertons were set upon radical labor movements in an effort to destroy the solidarity of those labor movements. And I think that this is just a high-tech version of that. And we have to resist it if we want to have true democracy or social or democratic socialism.